Yes, guys, what is going on? Welcome back to another episode of the Adapt Performance Podcast. In today's episode, we are joined by absolute jumping royalty. Okay, so we are joined by the wizard that is Matt McInnes Watson. Okay, so the Plyo guy, also the founder of Plyos. All right, so in this episode, we go through a lot. Okay, and we're going to get into that in a little second. But before we kind of delve into it, what I want to talk to you about is, something I'm really proud of, the work that we're doing behind the scenes at Adapt. All right. I had a conversation with one of my guys who I've been working with for the past year and a half. Okay. And when we first started our journey together, the coaching process, we were on the phone. Okay. We were talking through what would success look like in his case. Okay. And he was basically saying, look, I'm not the most physically gifted athlete in the world. I'm not the best rugby player in the world. But one of my goals is to be one of the best players at my club. And I'm quite a way off at the moment. And, we broke that down and we broke it into different physical qualities that we could try and improve. We did some performance testing. We had a good little chat around that thing. And he called me this week. Okay. We weren't meant to speak, but I picked up the phone. I saw his name. I was like, oh, doesn't sound good. And we spoke on the phone and he was like, mate, it finally happened. He said he was walking past the ground on his way out after a training session, and one of the boys grabbed him and went, mate, I don't know what you've done in the last year or so, but you're definitely one of the best players that we've got on the team at the moment. You're absolutely smashing it, and just hearing that, this is, if there's any coaches out there, you'll get that as like one of the warmest, proudest things that's ever happened. It's like, fucking go on then, absolutely chuffed for him. Really chuffed that he's had that because he's really kind of consistent and he does the work. But for me, I'm just really happy that I was able to kind of facilitate that, and put a program in place where he could achieve it. So without kind of selling it too hard, if there's any athletes or coaches out there that are looking to really kind of push their physical development to the next level and are looking to basically have a really personalized and professional approach to their strength and conditioning, give us a shout. Okay. We're going to be taking on new athletes start of the new year. So this will come out in the next week, this podcast. So by that point, we'll be kind of gearing up to take on a few new people. All right. So getting into the actual nuts and bolts of the episode then, this was sick. Honestly, Matt is so clever, and he's obviously a great athlete as well. So it's a really good mix of good training chat. What we go through is a little bit of, the philosophical. Okay, I got that word right for once. Usually I struggle, but some of the philosophy around coaching. Okay, so can you teach coaching intuition? Okay, the art of coaching side of things, going by feel. Sometimes we're probably a little bit too restrictive in the way that we do things based off the theory and looking at the science and the guidelines. Sometimes it's probably a good idea to say fuck off to the rules. Not always, but, occasionally it could be good for a lot of us. We also get into the nitty gritty of plyos. Okay. We start speaking through what are some of the pros and cons of different equipment that we see being used in jumping. Okay, so medicine balls, what are the good and bads of it? Okay, box jumps, what are the goods and bads? We also go through hurdles. Okay, do they restrict us or do they actually spur us on? And we kind of discuss some of those things. So as always, I'm absolutely buzzing with this episode. So do me a favor. Let me know if there was anything in particular you really enjoyed about the episode. Okay. Was there any quick little one-liners or is there any exercises? Is there any kind of thought processes that you're going to take away from today and you're going to kind of mull over? Let me know about them. Let Matt know about them. Okay. It helps us know that the content that we're putting out is of value. All right. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. This is me and Matt McInnes Watson. Yes, Matt. How's it going, mate? You okay?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Hope you're well.
I'm very well, mate. I've got a new coffee blend on the go. I've got some blonde roast. It's beautiful. A lovely drop. What have you been doing today, mate?
So it's just been a morning of preparing some program stuff that I'm filming for. We're doing some collaboration work with an Olympic weightlifting coach, and yeah, doing a little bit of bridging some of my stuff into that realm of sport, which is testing me, that's for sure. It's really kind of, let me just chuck everything up against the wall and seeing what should stick and what always should stick. And, maybe we don't need as much of that, but we need a bit more of that, which has been quite, I don't know if it's been fun, but it's been, it's kind of been like frustrating me to be like, come on, like start to process some of this and figure it out and problem solve. So yeah, just a bit of that and looking after my daughter this morning. So
nice. How old is she?
She is coming up 9 months, but feels about 3 years old in terms of the way that she is. She is crazy. I don't know if it's me. Like I tend to be quite excitable around her, and I don't think that helps. But she's like, in the last month, she's gone from not crawling to wanting to stand up and try and run. So it's just a bit like
testament to your Plyos, mate. Testament to the Plyo program, innit? Feed them young. Awesome stuff, mate. Love it. With those Plyos that you're going to try and branch out into the weightlifting, is that with, I don't know his real name, K. Speed? Is that him?
Yeah, Chris Speed. Yeah, it's
that's the new age of people, mate. You just know people by Instagram handles. That's it. Nobody has names anymore.
I know, it's terrible. And I always find the worst thing is you're like, they don't even have their name in their bio, and I'm like, oh, well, he's just that, and or you pronounce the name completely wrong, and you say it to someone, and they're like, who? And you're like, this guy, and they're like, no, it's said like this. But yeah, Chris is a weightlifting coach, so we're doing stuff with him, and Kean O'Brien as well is kind of in the mix of helping us out with that, and I know that he's going to be jumping on maybe the second installment of it. But it's going to be really interesting, really quite fun in terms of how Chris has kind of taken on some of the stuff and looked at some of the deeper yielding work and how that translates well. And the biggest thing that we've seen, I think, so far is things like knee health. So it kind of is becoming, we do a lot of we're playing around a lot with deep oscillatory work where there's almost like a relaxed bounce at the bottom of movements, and just having smooth sequences in and out, and not having kind of moments within a lift where there's too much static position and you're lurching out of it. There's not as many sticking points to it. So when I think the smoothness of greasing the joints seems to be I don't know whether it's kind of anesthetic or whether it is doing something in terms of helping the tendon, or you're getting a bit of, I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like we're trying these methods, and I think we're seeing straight away some really good anecdotal stuff. Unfortunately, there's poor research on any of it, and it's going to be a little bit of my PhD, and I'm going to do some testing on the deeper yielding landing and takeoffs, and I think that it's going to have a larger effect than I think it's going to in terms of what it can do over time, and how many more people should be using it, because I tend to get that feedback a lot, all the other stuff is great, all the real dynamic stuff is great that we do, but the deep stuff, I don't know what it's doing, but it's just changing the way that I feel coming in and out of movement. And I just don't think that people have done people have kind of subconsciously done it for a while. They've done plenty of deep split jumps, lunges, whatever you want to call them, but actually having more of a well put together program, and thinking about loading patterns, thinking about volume, thinking about how you might introduce different intensities to things. I don't think a lot of people have attacked it, and if they have, please tell me, because I'd like to read into their stuff. But from what I have seen, I haven't seen a lot of it, but I've seen that anecdotally it's had some tremendous effects on people, and I always say this, how this supports the rest of what they do in terms of the dynamic sense. Kean O'Brien always says to me, it's the contrast to what he does in the weight room, whether it's the super dynamic plyo stuff or whether it's some of the deep stuff. It is contrasting the stiff overcoming stuff, and it contrasts it really well. And it's like, some days you just want that flick of a switch and you want to do more yielding work. And actually, when you look at a lot of the physical therapy stuff on social media now, a lot of that seems to be the way. If you've got people that do too much stiff stuff, they need to be doing a bit more yielding work to, just relax and release tissue in different ways, taking it through different ranges of motion. And
do you think there's
it could be an awesome place.
So it makes sense that there'd be a tissue response to that lengthening, that relaxation, all those things. Would you say there's going to be a central nervous system contributor to that, just from spending all that time in the lower positions? Just from being comfortable down there and, letting the brain kind of switch off a little bit?
I think so. I think that I always say this. It almost becomes a little bit more metabolic in the sense, especially because you can do quite a decent volume of that stuff. It's quite you don't obviously need the recoverability of it movement to movement, so it starts to become that thing where you're like gassed out a little bit by the end of like a good 5 or 6 movements, because you're just going from one to the other. So you tend to get a lot, and you'll find sometimes, like I come out of the bottom of a movement and I'm like, oh, my glutes are screaming at me, or VM's screaming at me, or whatever it might be, and you're like, well, obviously it's because that time under tension it definitely has an effect, and there's clearly some higher blood flow need because of it. So like you say, are you shutting things down? Not shutting things down, but as you kind of termed it, are you kind of relaxing the central nervous side of it, and it's not so kind of neurally stimulating? It becomes a bit more, a bit more metabolic,
accustomed to that range and accustomed to that. Okay.
Yeah.
So with that, for people that haven't kind of come across your tiered system before, can you give us a quick whistle stop tour of what deep is and what the other versions are, just so people can get up to speed with that?
Yeah, so let's say from the top down, so our maximal or intensive plyometrics are what we class as our ping tier. To kind of not get them too confused with the drop jump, depth jump kind of split, whether it's super stiff or whether it's a little bit more yielding. Our ping tier stuff is as fast on the ground as possible with as much intent as possible. So there's kind of a bit of a mixture of both of those. And then if you come down from that into more submaximal tiers, we have our medium tier, which is kind of, as it says, it's kind of middle of the line. It's more locomotive in general. You'll see a lot more kind of relaxed hopping and bounding for distance. It's smoother. There's a lot more fluidity to that kind of movement. And obviously you want that at the higher intent movements, but it's just far more relaxed in a sense in the medium tier. And then below that, to make the real kind of rudimentary tier, is our light tier, which is very, as it says, light. It's rhythmical, still quite fast on the ground, but the intent is just not there. The displacement of the center of mass isn't as much there as it is to the medium, and then onto the ping tier stuff. And then our deep tier isn't necessarily plyometric. That's why I kind of didn't use the phrase plyometric in there when I spoke about the deep tier stuff before. But there are landings and takeoffs to all of the deep tier movements, and the time on the ground is obviously a lot longer because you have much deeper ranges of motion around those major joints that you're working. So the prime example all the time that I use is like a split stance. If you're jumping into a split squat kind of position, you're dropping down, the back knee almost touches the floor, and then you're coming back out of it. You're landing and taking off in that sequence. So that's how we kind of set our 4 tiers. The deep tier is our kind of supporting tier. And then, how you look to program them is all dependent on how you want to undulate that throughout the given part within the year, which I think is the biggest impact of having that system. People don't like to be like, I don't like to follow a system perfectly. And I'm like, well, if you want some pretty good guidelines, and I always will deviate a little bit out of them. I'm like, I don't really have a place for this thing. That's fine. If it's quick, if it's dynamic, then I chuck it in a certain place. If it's not, then it drops down into more medium stuff or more let's say deep tier or light tier.
Nice. No, that's perfect, mate. I think that'll make a lot of sense to people. And I always do this, mate. I have a habit of just getting straight into the good stuff. Let's circle back round real quick. Tell people who you are. This always happens. So who you are, where you've been, and essentially what you do, and then we can kind of buzz through. Yeah.
So, Matt McInnes Watson. If you might find me on social media as McInnes Watson, and the system that all of our plyos is within is our business called Plus Plyos, and we initially set Plus Plyos up as no one was really providing anything as we started off calling it a supplement to your program, and now it's a complement to your program because it sounds a bit better on the on the tongue. But we just started to put programs out, and this was in the midst of us living in Abu Dhabi. So we lived in Abu Dhabi for 3 years. We've just recently returned, which I went out for a teaching role, and just time for me to free space up to start things like Plyos and to do more educational based work. And really, it was a COVID baby to us, and it was time for us to be able to put together a program that people could just grab and go, and really you can jump onto our subscription and you get access to every single video program for all sports. There's a return to play program on there as well, and we add a little bit of education, but now we're starting to really move into a few different directions with things. There's a lot more physical therapy stuff that we're working on, and just a mixture of good educational stuff that's supporting people with our course and stuff. So yeah, that's really the domain that we're working within at the moment. I say we, it's because myself and my wife run the business together. She does all the background work, and I do all the kind of front facing content based bits. So yeah, that's been the last 2 or 3 years for us, and it's been a part of my, I don't know what you want to call athletic journey, coaching journey, whatever. It's kind of from the day I opened my eyes to the world of track and field. That was kind of the first instance where I was like, wow, like this is how people should move. I've never seen people move quite as well as track and field athletes did. And I was like, well, why can't other people move quite like this? So, you dig a little bit deeper and figure out some of those systems, and the influences that I had have been a continued influence on me for the last kind of 13, 14 years now. So yeah, it's always been there humming in the background, whether I was, consciously working on it or not. And now it's the forefront of everything that we're doing. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Was that your athletic background? Was it track and field? Is that what you did?
Yeah, so I started, as most people do in the UK, I started playing football from the age of about 5, and then played until I was about kind of a crossover of like 17, 18. And in there, I started to play a bit of basketball when I was about 17. And from that, I played a few years of basketball pretty poorly, but was quite athletic on a basketball court, which I didn't know that I was very athletic on a football pitch. Which was, it's interesting to find maybe stiffer surfaces suit me better than softer surfaces. And I know that now, because when I go back to grass pitches, I just deplete within minutes trying to run on anything soft. So it was kind of an introduction then into, well, you can jump pretty high. Maybe you should go out and try high jump. And at the age of 18, I went down and started high jumping. And I was an okay high jumper. I just think that I didn't have the technical time that others had doing it since they were maybe 12 or 13. So yeah, that was my kind of through route then into opening my eyes to plyometrics. And I was a track athlete for 8 or 9 years, and that kind of bridged into doing the last 2 years of being an athlete is when I started to coach, because my coach kind of pulled out of being able to coach us, and from that it was kind of a direct move into a full-time kind of position of coaching multi-eventers and jumpers and stuff. And I think coaching multi-eventers was the best thing that could ever happen to me in terms of understanding how to piece together a program when it's so complex and you have so many variables that you have to make sure are important at the same time. So yeah, that's kind of my athletic background and how that merged into coaching.
So building from that into, where you've kind of got plus Plyos, and you've got these different, systems and methodologies and all those things. I was listening to, Dr. Pat Davidson. He had Angus Bradley on his podcast pretty recently, and that was a really, really good listen. And, they went everywhere and everywhere, as you can imagine. It was loads of different topics, but they were discussing how hard it is to actually document your thoughts in a coherent way, and to have 4 tiers and a little bit more of an idea of this leads into this and this leads into this. How did you find that process of actually just building a system?
Well, the system kind of inherently has kind of been passed down anyway. So it's not, it's not my out and out system anyway. It comes from the work that my mentor had done, my mentor Eric Little, and what he'd done, and how he had been influenced by. I spoke about this the other day actually. Yeah, he'd been influenced by Zoltan Tenke, who I put a post up, and he'd written books back in the 80s on some Medball stuff. And Zoltan he's a Hungarian coach, which I was slapped on the wrist for the other day. I thought he was Polish. Anyway, he moved. He did move with the Polish sector of coaches that went over to Canada in the 70s, and Eric was kind of introduced to his stuff as an athlete when Eric was a decathlete in the 70s. And yeah, apparently blew his mind as much as it kind of blew my mind when I entered into Eric's kind of step forward in what Zoltan had done with him. So there was always those tiers put together. I'll never say that I've necessarily done a better job than Eric has in terms of, piecing it together, but hopefully I've helped to systematize it more to the larger public in making it something that you don't even have to hear me talk about it. You can literally just go to something, read, this is the system, and I can go, cool. I roughly can figure out what these things are. I can see that I do certain movements and they would fit in those tiers. And this is why I would use more of this at this time of the year and more of this at this time of the year. And that's ultimately where I think I've done my part of the job. And also my part of the job is getting Eric's work out there because of Eric's age and stuff, and him just not being as tech savvy or whatever you want to call it, and not being within the kind of social media realms. It's my job as one of his mentees to push this stuff and get people to understand how impactful it can be, and how impactful it can be on your athletes, but actually how impactful it can be when you're trying to organize 1,000 different things that you could potentially be putting into a program.
I think that's such an important...
Yeah, I was going to say, ultimately, it's really the toughest part, I think, as a coach. And it's sometimes the hardest thing for me is just going, how do I fit this? Where do I fit this? I've got so many things that I could potentially be putting in. And all right, great, and I'm going to put all of these things in, but where does this fit? So having some guidelines it's so much easier for you. And sometimes actually setting a guideline to saying, you're not going to drift out of this and come up with these weird and wonderful things to do, and you're just going to fit into these guidelines or, different buckets that you're going to put movements into, and that's what you got. Work with it, and coach around that. When you're coaching the person, you say, okay, maybe that doesn't work, we'll change it up. That's fine. But when you've got to write a program week to week, I think it's probably one of my worst assets as a coach is program writing. Like I can't stand it. I don't know how there were ever groups of people before that would sit down and write 6 months of training. It would take me 6 months to write it. Like that's how I feel, and how cumbersome it feels to me doing this stuff. So like coaching online, I find quite tough. Like I'd rather have conversations about things and just say, what, I think you should go out. Like if I had the ability to do that with the athletes that I work with individually, then I'd prefer that. I prefer rolling up to a facility and going, right, let's see how you're moving. How do you feel? Cool. We're doing this. Maybe that's a good part of my coaching kind of toolbox. But I know that the planning side of it is poor.
Is that how you were coached, with Eric and all those people? Is that something you've kind of modelled your behaviour on, and you've seen how well it works and how it made you feel as an athlete?
Yeah, definitely. There was always a plan, but, when we got to... obviously the skill side of... Because you're working in track and field, like your track coach is your physical and skill coach. So you've always got someone... And, people might be like, well, track and field, there's not much skill domain to it. Obviously, there are parts of it that are, there are skills to track and field and being able to move. There are skills. If you were to compare it to more hand-eye coordination stuff or foot-eye coordination stuff, then yeah, okay, there's differences in it. But when it comes to the skill component, 100%. And obviously, there's a large physical component to the skill work as well that you do in track and field. But there's a relative plan. But we are solving pieces to the puzzle, and if you're training on a Monday, and let's say that you're doing a technical, and I was a high jump, we're doing a technical high jump session, who cares what the rest of the week looks like? We have a job to do right now on Monday, and we're solving problems in that given time. If we can't solve those problems because of fatigue, then we know what's going to happen Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. If we continue to try and solve the problem because we're fresh and we have the ability to, like that, I think there was a lot more of that went on in our coaching, and obviously the freedom to be able to do that is great. Sometimes you just can't do that, but also I think that it can be quite valuable. And let's say that you've got 2 sessions a week with a group of, let's say you're working with a football team or a rugby team. They come in on a Tuesday, and you say, well, this is roughly what we've got planned, and you continue to work through those stuff, and the guys are getting fatigued, and you're thinking they're not going to be in great shape Thursday. So what? Call Thursday off. Like that's almost the essence that I go with, is that if you're getting quality work in there at a certain time and the guys are getting a good exposure to that in the given moment, why are we really bothered about the rest of the week? Obviously they need to have, certain amounts of things at certain times, but we're so much more kind of, we've got to make sure that we do these things at this part in the week. And if it is all the auxiliary stuff, great, just chuck that in on the Thursday. But if your guys are flying and they are solving problems and they are understanding things in that given moment, and you go, cut the session because we can only do 10 of these today, I don't know. That to me, I think that takes the art of coaching out of it. Angus is definitely the one for speaking about art and the mixture of art and science and how they marry up together. But there's a time where I think that you just step in as a coach, and you either continue to allow good things to happen, or you step in and say, this is, it's got too much at this point. And ultimately that's where great coaches come in. And I think I was just very lucky to have had that kind of influence in Eric and the way that he did do that. If I'm having a great session, why do we cut that short? If we know that we've got 4 or 5 days until a competition, but we've got a session in between that, so what if we have an awesome session on the Tuesday, don't do much on the Thursday, and then we're ready on Saturday? That's great. In my eyes, I think that should be the way that you should be looking at things, for especially with dynamic movement that have a lot of neuromuscular skill built into what you're doing.
I think that's a really interesting point, and what I'm thinking through there is that's like a coach's intuition thing, isn't it? That's like you would struggle to get that written down, and you would struggle to be able to teach people how to think that way, because there's going to be no similarities. Sometimes you could have 2 different times of the year where you may be like, you know what, I did that last time, but I've got a different vibe in the room today. We're going to push on. And I think that's some of the stuff that I love about coaching and hate about it at the same time, to be honest with you, is because you can spend so long thinking about these things, and it's almost like, what makes a difference? Me and you could have exactly the same skill set experience, but you could have a little bit of a better, trying to think, like decision making on the time, dealing with those things. And I don't really know where I was even going with that point, but I think it's such an interesting topic that I've spoke about before as well, coach's intuition, and how do you actually develop that? What's your thoughts there?
Unfortunately, experience is normally the biggest thing. And not necessarily just experience yourself, but being with others that have good intuition, I think is also a good one. And you can say, well, you're like, why has he made that decision now? And then you can ask those sort of questions as to, like, why have you cut that, or why have you continued to allow that to happen? If we've still, it's meant to be 5 attempts at something, 10 repetitions or something. Like, why have you continued to add reps to that? Why have you cut that short? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? What are you thinking about that comes after this? If you understand that, let's say it can be as simple as working in a gym environment, and you're watching a small auxiliary part of the session, and you know that something else is coming next, and you're thinking that's maybe having a detrimental effect on the big ticket in this session, so I'm going to cut that because it's going to have a detrimental effect on what we really need to be working on here. And that auxiliary thing can come later in the week. And it's knowing the athlete that you're working with. It's knowing what you should be looking at, when you should be looking at it, and what's to come next and stuff. So, but also, it's being in the moment and not, I've kind of flipped that back on its head, but being in the moment of coaching what's in front of you and saying, give me another 2 reps, let me see what that looks like again. Let's see if you can continue to produce force at that, intensity, or reading that you're getting off of VBT software. Doesn't matter. Like if the athlete's going with it and vibing with it, why not keep running with it? Why? Yeah. I always just feel like that. Unless you're doing like a primer session for a competition the following day, if a guy feels good, go with it. Like, obviously you don't need to be killing them and thinking like we're just going to keep going because this guy feels amazing. But I think that's why like the world of professional dunking, although they have this kind of torrid chronic knee part to it, but some of these guys become so good at jumping well because what they do is built on feel. They just turn up to a court. There's no constraints to what they do. They just go out and they dunk for 2 hours. And like, if you would say that to like a jumps coach and you're like, yeah, this guy did like 50 full-blown maximal attempts up to a basketball hoop, they would lose their mind in the jumping community. Like, and I wanted to bring a little bit more of that to support the injury side of things and for people to understand that a bit more. But at the same time, like the play element, the intuition element of it, I think is really powerful. And I don't think that, like, when do you see a coach turn around to an athlete and say, well, how many reps are you going to get out of this? Or how many attempts are you going to do this? And they're like, you know what, I think I've got 2 good reps in it. Do enough coaches say, cool, well, we're going to do 2 reps. That's it. They're the ones that know their body the most. And you think that you've got enough in you to be like, no, you've got another this in you. You can do another one of those. Maybe they can't. Maybe they shouldn't. I could probably guarantee you that their injury history would probably be a lot smaller if you were to follow that intuition for a lot more people.
Yeah, no, I agree, mate. I think what I'm kind of getting from these chats that we're having now is around experience is going to be a big thing, your influences, but I think there's that element of trial and error, isn't there? There's doing something, let's figure it out. If it goes well, amazing, we might have something to pursue in the future. If it went really badly, maybe we'll just approach with caution in the future. So one of the reasons I wanted to get you on, Matt, was around the post that you put out last week around drop jumps and using hurdles. So can you give us a little bit of context around that post initially, and then kind of just gives you an opportunity to not be confined into a paragraph of coaching?
Yeah. So the post is of was it of the male and the female athlete that were falling off of a box and doing the kind of fake hurdle idea. So if you haven't seen it, I think it's definitely worth just checking out and having a look at that post and what was the the small sector of kind of writing that I put together on it. But I think again, it has a little bit of a back and forth as to, are you contradicting yourself a little bit because you are using a platform already, or are you using an external stimulus already to create and evoke that kind of larger gravity fall? But I was working with athletes that I felt were right to be doing a little bit of depth jump work. But I think if you have one stimulus there and it's a different stimulus falling off of a box and then jumping over a hurdle, I think they are different, because the falling element has a much more different I would say like a neural pattern to it. I think a lot of people do struggle with this because they don't have the on and off cycle of how muscles are turning on and off, or how they're activating on and off. When you're using like a ground-based contact, becoming airborne and then hitting the ground again, you have that cyclical nature of turning things on and off. When you're stood on a platform, well, you just have to turn things on, and it's quite unnatural. And I remember doing like really weird sequences when I used to, without realizing, I used to stand on top of like a platform, and I would just consciously like squeeze my glutes really hard together. I do not know why, but I would get like a heavy contraction, and then I would step out and then want that to fire in the same sort of way, because I knew that if I got good hip flinch out of the bottom and then out of the top of it, it would kind of get that same sensation that I wanted when I was on top of the box. And whether that was a bit of kind of sensational imagery, then great. But adding that second stimulus of then trying to get over a hurdle, I think it just pays too much to what happens on the ground, and we are thinking far too much about clearing the hurdle rather than the quality of what's going on the floor. So, people say to me, well, I use the hurdle to evoke that stimulus. I want them to be as fast on the ground as possible. And I'm like, cool, but are you watching also what's happening on the ground and the quality of that landing contact? And whether that's preferable to how you want them to produce force away from that scenario. I've personally found that the risk and reward to it is pretty poor. Like I don't think that the value in also trying to clear the barrier and not landing on top of it, I just don't think that there's that as much valuable as just not using it and taking it away. And I'll always say that. And I did a piece of research a while back for my master's thesis, and I looked at depth jumps off of a box and what I class as self-selected depth jumps, where the athlete would just jump up as high as they could into the air, select kind of how high they want to fall from, and then hit the ground, as opposed to falling from a platform or using like a hurdle to create that. And the best statistics came from the self-selected numbers. The guys were, we did a few where we pre-tested their just standing vertical. I said, right, you're going to jump for as much height as possible. And we used that as the dictator, because I've seen it quite a lot in research, as the dictator of height to fall from. So if it was 60 centimeters or 40 centimeters, 50 centimeters, they would fall from those heights that they achieved in the maximal counter movement jump. And then we looked at the self-selected stuff, and the self-selected stuff was it was in and around kind of 10 to 12% below their maximal output. And, that straight away, we talk about this funny thing called self-organization. That to me is the perfect way of self-organizing. That is understanding. I don't want to be, for starters, maybe trying too hard is not allowing me to think enough about what I'm about to experience, the other side of this flight, and coming into landing. But I also think that they're able to just gauge a bit better, what kind of trajectory do I want to get the most out of that next landing. And in that scenario, I did use boxes to step off of, but we used a knee-high kind of fake hurdle clearance all the time with just locomotive-based plyometrics. And I found that, I just say to an athlete, we are working on these specific cues as a focus in towards the ground. The second thought is to pop your knees up into the air, but then they don't have to think about what's happening with the hurdles, where the hurdles are placed. It's, added stress for you to know exactly how far apart those hurdles should be spaced. There's a lot to it that you just think, just take them away, move freely, and work on what's on the ground rather than trying to think about what's in the air.
Yeah, I think, you're probably one of the first people I've seen really speak about that, the fear element of hurdles. And I've always kind of had this thought of people just try and survive. That is literally the thing. People just don't want to fall. And, you get this massive kind of knees coming up to your chest more so, you don't get solid contact. So it was interesting for me to see that. And I think I was almost expecting more pushback. I kind of wanted it. I wanted people to kind of jump in and be like, give you some discussion points around it. Because I can remember, when I first started S&C, however many years ago, I'd be on Instagram, I'd be looking through, hashtag strength and conditioning. And it seemed to be a lot of like the Australian guys at the time were doing all these fancy plyo sequences where it was hopping over a hurdle to a box jump and it was single leg, it was twisting. And that was kind of my first experience of it. And it never felt right. It felt dodgy. It didn't feel, I guess they would probably argue it was super specific. To me, it just felt like it was nothing. That was my thoughts at the time.
Yeah.
What's, because this is something I was really curious about, actually. When I did your intro to Plyo's course, and I'm going off on one here. Do you use box jumps very, very often? Or boxes in general? I know you mentioned there you used it for an actual drop. Do you ever use them in terms of reducing landing impact, or does it depend?
Yeah, I have done in parts for reducing landing impact, but not a lot, to be honest with you. I just tend to use ground. I tend to use that as a way to evoke the stimulus. using velocity and overload and mixing them together is ultimately how I get that stimulus. And yeah, I just don't tend to use boxes, and I think that boxes and hurdles are just normally, I would say for 80% of people, they are just thrown in there for whatever reason. Like you said, it's almost a case of them being nothing. The like the random drill stuff that you see, I'm like, cool. So how do you place that into your program? How is that systematized? Like, how do I take that and put that in my coaching? So you have an athlete that, you know, they fall from a box, they go over a hurdle, and they go right or they go left, then they go on to another box, whatever that might be. I'm like, how do you measure fatigue? How do you measure intensity of it? How are you monitoring ground contacts? What should it actually look like? Do you know what it actually should look like? Do they understand what it should look like? Should certain contacts be longer? Should they be more, you know, yielding as opposed to more overcoming? It's just, oh, well, we're getting a stimulus, we're getting it in multiple directions, and that's it. And I'm like, okay, cool. How do I learn about this? How can I put this into my program? And 99% of the time, it's just copycat stuff. That looks cool, so I'm going to try it with my athletes.
Mm-hmm.
Does it stay in the program long? No, because it doesn't have the systematic depth to it, in my opinion. And people will always, you know, there's a lot of hate against systems and stuff because it's, you know, it's maybe a bit more compounding than they want it to be, or, you know, there's a bit more of a ring fence around what you can do with it. But on the flip side of things, it just keeps you know what you're coaching, and you know how to monitor things, and you can understand it a little bit more in depth rather than just chucking things up in the air, seeing where the hurdle lands, seeing where the box lands, whether it lands on 60 centimeters as opposed to 45 centimeters as opposed to, you know, a full size hurdle to a short size hurdle. That's kind of, it's like rolling the dice every morning. You've got 4 different dice. One's a hurdle, one's a box, one's it's unilateral or bilateral, and then it's direction of movement, and they go like this. Oh, what are we going to put on Instagram today? That's kind of what it looks like to me. And
specificity.
Apparently. So yeah, that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah, there's no argument or discussion with you from me there. I'm of the same thoughts, and maybe it's just because we don't understand. You know, maybe we just don't understand their thought processes, or they haven't put it out there for us to actually, you know, delve into those things. That's obviously another side of it, but I don't think that is the case here. Moving on from that, so one of the things I was really curious about, actually, and this is, I guess it kind of feeds into your mission with Plus Plyos, how it's for the most part undertaught, understood, and there's not really as much education around it, was how you actually program plyos. Okay, so for example, I saw some of the programs you were putting together, and you may do one set of 10 different exercises or 10 different approaches versus doing 3 sets of, I don't know, box jumps, 3 sets of broad jumps, 3 sets of plyos. You know, how come? You know, why would you not do 3 sets of 3 exercises?
My mentor would always come full circle on things and say, you know, a takeoff is a takeoff, and the precision element to landing safety, to the capacity of being able to be, you know, whether you use the phrase dynamic or powerful or strong or fast in many different domains, I think is really valuable. And we found that high variability to movements that aren't necessarily that different. They just have very small nuance to them. We found that had a massive bang for its buck in terms of, like, I like to keep, like, plyometrics to me are, you know, I can make them as specific as I want to, but ultimately they are preparation. They are not the thing. So keep it not the thing, and keep it quite general. So when you have a place where it's going to be a low intensity block with high volume, make it multi-directional. Make it really sub-maximal, really multi-directional. Make your athletes effective in moving in different planes of motion. different changes of direction, different rhythms, different depths, different stiffness factors, different, whatever you can make slightly different, I think has a lot of value. I know we just spoke about the craziness of just kind of adding in random bits of it. When you understand some of the systems and the movements that we do, when you say, Jordan, about, they're all slightly different movements, they are slightly different, but they tend to be relatively similar in terms of like ground contact time. They tend to be similar in terms of when you're moving in within a certain block, even the differences between unilateral and bilateral, there won't be such drastic changes that we're really throwing in something crazy like adding a hurdle when you move laterally, or it all tends to be locomotion in one direction in most of what we do anyway. So if it's the difference between, let's say that you've got 3 movements and we were going to do some light tier movements and you're just going to be doing it in a linear fashion. Well, the first movement for 10 meters, let's say, is a forward leap, just bilateral leaps forward. The second movement might be split stance, bilateral leaps forward. So it's a small split stance, but you're moving forward bilaterally. And then the third movement might be an exchange of that split stance moving forward. So those differences can be very small. They're not necessarily really grand in terms of let's adding in a completely different stimulus to, increasing box height, to adding in another hurdle, to completely changing the direction of things. When we do have more of a hyper focus on, let's say you're doing movements that are 2 forwards and 1 back, there is a little bit more, I would say, specific focus on that within the program. But I think that variability, if your athlete is able to move in, let's say, a circle that's kind of as big as you want to make it, and they have the capacity to do that, rather than the athlete that's kind of really pinpointed and they're really specific and good at what they do within that realm, I've just found that the injury potential for those movements outside of that little part of the specific side of their sport, I think has a lot of danger within it. And, I think why we're successful at what we do is because when we have people on things like return to play programs, or the stuff that we have within our programs that support all the, the higher stimulating stuff like our intense ping work, I think everything else supports that. We don't go crazy when it comes to our ping stuff. If you look at some of those tiers, it's pretty simple. If we have one focus for the day, it might be vertical displacement, it could be unilateral horizontal displacement. We tend to focus on that, and it might be that you move from bounds to hops, but it's not drastic.
So with that, when I first saw you doing a lot of different exercises of slightly different, the first thing I kind of thought of was it looks enough like the thing, but has small variances. And I was thinking about, does that have potential to help avoid overuse injuries because there's that little bit of variety? Is there a little bit of a nervous system effect of building a little bit of a bandwidth of achieving a really good outcome, even though you're in less than optimal situations? And I was just thinking about, some of the worst case scenario work that you may do in the gym with an athlete. I kind of put it into my mind as I do a lot of neck work with rugby players and fighters, and we don't always do neck work perfectly neutral. I will put them into a little bit of a shit position where they're a little bit more lengthened and try and work through that. And that's kind of how I saw some of those plyo things. Does that make sense, or do you think I'm off the mark there?
I think you got a great chain of thought there. It makes a lot of sense to me in terms of how you'd look at it like that, for sure. It's I always look at things in terms of the kind of neural link between your brain and the joint that's receiving that neural signal. And I talk about it in terms of like a motorway or highway junction of those different signals that have been sent. Some people have just got that one fine chord of real specificness, but if you've got a real deep depth of different lines of that kind of motorway that you can, if it's slightly off center, if it's slightly, you're moving in a backwards motion, if it's a change in direction, if you can have that, it's just a bigger array of skills there. I think it's going to serve you really well, because ultimately plyometrics are for physical preparation. They are the prep to your sport. So don't make it too specific if it doesn't need to be.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And then I guess moving on to the next one, because this one really got me curious. Again, I hadn't seen much of it before you started putting work out, was around using Medballs. So using Medballs to overload or unload, and how are you using those in your plyo work? Is that specifically for more of your deep tiers, your light tiers, your mediums? Do you not use it for any of your ping? Just talk to me about how you would kind of program some of the Medball stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, it's dependent on what you aim to do with it. I think the ping tier stuff is always quite difficult when it comes to, if you want the more neural stimulating side of things for like faster ground contact times, adding in a med ball is maybe detrimental to that side of things. If you're looking to chase more of the overload side to it, so if you're looking at more depth jump as opposed to drop jump strategies to more intense work, then they can be really valuable in that realm of things. And that's always the way that you've got to look at it, is even with a very small med ball, you're going to have quite a large effect on speed and ground contact time. So whether it's traveling velocity, whether it's ground contact velocity, and how you get out of that, it's going to have an effect with a small external stimulus like a med ball. You're also getting the loss of contribution of your arms as well, because you're having to hold the med ball. So you have to take that into an account, and looking at where you might see decrements in force output. So the med ball can be an addition of postural loading. So if you're looking to overload your posture and how you deal with certain forces, I think a med ball is used in that domain. It's used in ways in which you can control things a bit better. So using them in deep tier or more sub-maximal based plyos is definitely preferable. I love them in the deep tier stuff because it's so outrightly obvious when you're swinging a med ball into the bottom of a movement, or whether you're orientating it in a different way, how are you able to deal with that with your posture? Because your posture ultimately dictates everything when it comes to landing mechanics and dynamics in and out of that movement. And it's our remedy or it's our indicator and remedy tool to most things. So I've used the idea before of doing things like taking the arms away or using a med ball in things like a hopping or a unilateral propulsion off of just a single leg. And whether you've got athletes that lurch, let's say, towards that leg. So if you're hopping continuously on your right side, do you lurch to your right side to kind of protect that when it gets exposed to that real high force? Putting a med ball in, it exposes it even further. So you can use the med ball to find that indication of the issue, but you can also chuck that med ball in to put into different positions, maybe turn down the amplitude of that hop that you're doing, and to now start to build in that capacity for the posture to be able to control that hopping action. So it can be both, as I said, indicator and remedy to those issues that you might have. I also do really like them in the medium tier as well. There's nothing better than seeing someone kind of bound, kind of nice relaxed bounding over kind of long distances, holding a med ball out in front of them. It's just, it's maybe not so kind of steeped in the research side of things, because there really isn't any research on it out there. But when you have a keen eye for things and you see some movements that just look good with a med ball, they look like they maybe change the flow of someone and someone over time, over maybe within the session or within a 3 or 4 week period, you see them start to solve that problem of maybe holding too much co-contraction in the air, not being able to orientate their body so much horizontally or for so much vertical displacement. Adding that in sometimes is the way to solve some of those issues, and I really like it. And if you're having a problem with testing an athlete, man, chuck a med ball in. It really does change things up. Do you know what? We ultimately were given that stimulus when we'd had about, I'd say, 3 or 4 years of plyometrics in us. And, we systematically did plyos every week for, I'd say, as part of Eric's program, probably almost 8 years. We had a couple of weeks off here and there, but we were always doing plyos. And in the depths of our winter season, because we didn't have an indoor facility, we used to spend a Tuesday night where we literally turned up and did plyometrics for an hour. So we were exposed to a lot. And then like 4 years in to be like, here's a med ball. Now see what happens. And you're like, oh, okay. You've just changed the game completely. Yeah. And you change the game every single time you give me a new variation of where to hold this thing. So it's a really useful tool. It's a very small part of your program, but it's another stimulus. It's another way to solve dynamic issues, because we often step so far back out of dynamic movement into more very kind of static based movement and try to solve problems at speed, when I think doing things like chucking in a small stimulus like that can be the way to do that.
Sorry, mate, just lost you towards the end. But, mate, with that, I think I just want to double up what you were saying, how it can completely change the game using a med ball. So when I saw you kind of throwing it around and kind of challenging your posture in general, I gave, what do you call them now? The curtsy lunge split jumps, just hopping from side to side. Now, I fully went from 0 to 100. So I hadn't done them before, but I was like, well, I've never done them before, but I'll grab a med ball and I'll start doing this sway thing from left to right, see if I can challenge it even more. Mate, my glutes have never hurt so bad for like the next 5 days. I thought I'd done damage. It was one of them. I think it was a blatant, I've gone too hard type of situation, but they felt great, and it was a good thing that I felt really uncoordinated with it in my mind, because there's going to be learning there, and I did it the week after and I got better. I did it the week after and I got better again. That is going to happen. It also got me thinking, I hadn't planned this as kind of a topic, but I don't know if you ever saw, what they're called? Is it the 1080 sprints, the resisted tether system? I saw people doing this with it basically not being directly behind them, but being a little bit off center, as a way of challenging their linear sprint, but basically pulling them to one side a little bit to see if they could reorientate. Have you ever seen that before?
I haven't seen that, no. It sounds interesting. I'd like to see what it looks like.
Yeah, and I was there wasn't really much of a caption beneath it because I think it was in Spanish, but I was looking at it thinking, you know what, there's something in that potentially, because there is going to be a postural requirement for you to stay on track and move forward. There's going to be some sort of changes, kind of similar to similar with the medicine ball stuff. If you was going to go for a run but hold the ball out in front of you or out to the side and you're locking off that pelvis and you're locking off the stair, whatever, I just thought, you know what, there's probably something in that. It's not going to be, 90% of your program by any means, but it may just give you a little bit of something to think about. And I think moving on from that, one of the things that it's made me think about with you bringing out these plus plyos and using medicine ball stuff more is I feel like it's grossly underrepresented in the UK because no gym has medicine balls you can use. It's massive wall balls that are huge. It's slam balls. There's not really a good selection. Similar to kettlebells, to be honest with you, mate. You've either got a 12 kilo kettlebell or you've got a 56. Yeah. So it just kind of shuts that off as an option for training. I think it's really kind of sad.
Yeah. And do you know what? You don't even need a med ball. Just go and get yourself a football or a basketball, and actually just offloading the body of having that contribution of your arms can be your first stimulus. It can be as simple as that. You don't even need a ball. You want to challenge yourself? Okay, for the next 2 weeks, you're going to have 5 movements where you're going to have your hands on your hips. How does that change things? If you find it relatively easy, for the following 2 weeks, you're going to have your hands on your head, like in a prisoner position. And then for the following 2 weeks after that, you're going to have your hands completely locked, arms overhead. believe me, those changes in themselves are enough to challenge overload and velocity and how they marry up together. Because we have data to suggest that we have a bandwidth of losing between kind of anywhere between 8 and 15% of power output and contribution to impulse. And on the flip side of things, people have, if they're ineffectively using their arms as well, when we go back to that kind of indicator and remedy thing, you can have detriments of up to 20% if you ineffectively use your arms as well. So understanding that if you don't have the hip control and you're trying to overdo it with your arms can have a detrimental effect to things. So you have to go back to the thing that you're trying to help out, which might be the way that you control your posture. So adding in a med ball, adding a constraint where you're taking away your arms and changing the positions of where they're held, there you go. That's straight away an easy fix. I've also had guys just hold, the baby dumbbells, 1 kg, 2 kg, something as basic as that. Something that you can swing around. And you know what, if you did drop it on your foot, it'd hurt, but you'd probably be all right. The med ball or ball side of thing, which I really think has an amazing effect, relates directly back to some of Eric's new stuff where it comes to like a tension and anchoring system, where if I'm holding the med ball out in front of me, kind of at eyes height, if I'm stabilizing the ball by getting an effective squeeze on something, so when I'm landing, it's getting that kind of impulse and shake. Well, I know that I'm stabilizing as I go in to hit the ground. Well, that stabilizes. So if my right hand is stabilizing against it, I'm getting an effective stabilization at the right shoulder, which has a contralateral effect to the left hip. Then I'm teaching myself how to stabilize better. And when I take that ball away, I have that learnt effect when I've done enough of it. So I now know that I can use my arm effectively. Let's say I'm just swinging it with a 2-arm or a single arm shift, that it will stabilize that shoulder, have a contralateral effect on the opposite hip. And then, you're onto a winner in terms of what that will do. If you're stabilizing at the hip better, then it's going to have a knockdown effect all the way into the floor. So having a ball, I quite like, because you have a grasping action to it. When you're holding something with handles, I think it changes it. You can cheat it a little bit. You can just use more of a forearm rather than like an overall kind of locking in position of the shoulder girdle, and how that kind of feels in terms of stabilization through like your lats and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, I think a ball shaped item is preferable. But if you don't have it, press your hands together. However you want to do it. It can be whatever. Use it by flinching with hands on your hips. I quite like to do that. That's another way of doing it. When you're hitting the ground, how do your hands contract into your hips? So those are surefire ways that you can do it if you don't have those within your gym. Also, I bought a med ball recently, 1 kg Reebok one off of Amazon for it's like 20 quid, not even. So, and it's relatively small. It's like a size 3 football, and I can chuck it in a bag and take it up a local park and jump around with it. So it works perfectly.
I feel like that's a really good end point in terms of some good practical information for people. Is just kind of have a little bit of an attitude of play, and just play around with things and just try different things and see how it feels, see how it makes it feel better, worse, faster, slower, off balance. I think you probably can't go too far wrong just having an experiment. Cool. So I want to wrap things up, mate. I just want to thank you for your time. I'm conscious of your time, giving up, an hour of your afternoon. So where can people find you, and give us a little bit of information what you got coming up?
Yeah, so you'll find me most on Instagram, and that can either be through McInnes Watson or plus Plyos. And both of them should be relatively easy to find. Other than that, plusplyos.com has kind of everything that we have to offer in terms of our subscription model that has everything from return to play plyometrics for very basic starts. I even have complete beginners start on our return to play stuff because it is so rudimentary, but it has a real nice kind of build up into moving at speed. That then merges into kind of as many sports as you can think of in terms of speed and power movement. And we've got a few hundred guys that currently use that, and are doing amazingly off of the back of it. And with that, we've got our intro to coaching biometrics course as well, which people tend to be finding a real simple resource to use to be able to, straight away say, well, what can I do with my system? How can I implement little things into it, understand the science a little bit, and see how movement should be. Over the next few months, we're going to be doing a few more seminars, live face-to-face stuff, which will be fun. Had a great time in Ireland last week doing that. So got lots more requests of us putting more out there for that. And loads of stuff that are coming from Eric Little's domain of that tension stuff that I spoke about. Oh, it's me flicking my thing up. So it's really exciting. We're looking forward to kind of little things that are coming up in the future in terms of those programs that might be coming out, and more educational stuff for coaches and athletes if they're interested.
That's awesome, mate. That's awesome. Cool. I will put all that information in the show notes below so people can just grab it at a click away. But again, I just want to thank you for your time, mate. I think that's going to be a load of good information for people to delve into. And, I think it'll definitely be coming your way anyway.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, mate.
Thanks, mate. Cheers.